that was. All right, why don't you start by introducing yourself and how you're related to the family?
Yes, my name is John C. Earle, better known as Jack Earle by all my friends. And as a youngster, even they called me Jackie. And even now and then, an old-timer, and I mean a real old-timer, will still call me Jackie, which I used to, as a child, object to this sort of thing, but I no longer do. In any event, I grew up in Hermansville, having been born in Menominee County in 1928, and lived there until the early 40s. And I'll say this, it was a great place to be born and raised as a child. There was always plenty to do in the area, many people to play with, and depending upon the season, we always had a great many unorganized but fun activities. In the summer, for instance, one of our main activities would center around the water, the mill pond, particularly. The railroad tracks ran right through the middle of the mill pond, and there was a bridge there called the Black Bridge, where all the young fellows in town learned how to swim. And I don't know where the girls ever learned how to swim, because I don't think there was a young fellow in town that owned a bathing suit. And, but we all had a wonderful time there. And one of our other activities concerning the mill pond was, which always at that time was filled with logs, was playing tag on the logs, which was great fun. Whenever someone got close to you, you always headed for the cedar logs, because they bobbed up and down quite readily, and they were hard to catch you if you were running on the cedars. Then you'd find a big old hemlock or a pine, you could rest on that until someone else came after you. And falling in was no problem. We did that all the time. We all knew how to swim and that sort of thing. And then this was close to what they called the number one or pine mill in Hermansville. And that was, Pine Mill was really a wonderful mill in many respects. It really sawed up the softer timber, like the pine logs, and not the logs with which they made the hardwood flooring, but it also had a cedar mill connected with it. But it was fun to, while it was operating, to go in and watch the logs being sawn up into boards, and then the boards being graded and sent out into the lumber piles to be piled up. And weekends, when no one was around, all of us kids, we weren't supposed to, but we played hide and seek in the mill. It was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful place to do so, because there were all these chutes and passageways and chains and things like that moved the timbers around, and a lot of hiding places, and we had just a great time in the mill. And then not too far away was a shingle shed, and we weren't supposed to, of course, but we removed some of these bundles of shingles and made a secret room out in this big shed, where we used to, this was kind of our club room. Or we would fool around the lumber piles, and the way they piled the lumber to air dry it, there was always a open air space in the middle, and you could crawl under the lumber piles and then up through inside the things. And if it was raining or something, it was a great place to get in out of the rain, or just to explore more. And so we always had plenty to do. And our house was seemingly kind of a gathering place. All the kids would come over there and roller skate, because we had a tennis court made of cement, and really it was the biggest piece of cement in town, so everybody came over to roller skate. We seldom ever played tennis on it, but it was great for roller skating. And in the summer, my mother used to make root beer, and she'd always had plenty of root beer available for hot days for whoever was there. And also, as far as swimming, we would ride our bikes over to what we called the Spalding River, over near Powers and Spalding. Somehow they called it the Hermansville River. But I guess the real name, I think, was the Cedar River. But we always called it the Spalding River, but we always had fun over there. And then another activity, of course, in the wintertime, centered around the mill pond, was ice skating. it was before we got too much snow, or if it was a winter without a lot of snow, it was just a wonderful place to skate. And we'd have great times there because most of us, what we'd do, we'd get one of the old pine stumps and set it afire, and each of us would bring a few potatoes along. And as the coals were right, we would wrap these potatoes in something and put them in the coals. And on a cold winter's night, those hot potatoes certainly did taste good. Trying to think of some of the other things we did. We had quite a large front lawn at our house, and we used to play football on it because there were 4 big elm trees. 2 at each end were almost like goalposts, and almost like a natural small football field. So we would play games out there, and whatever else we could think of. We never really got into too much trouble. I guess there wasn't that much trouble to get into, but we did what we could. And another thing that we did, we built a camp out in the woods a few miles. Actually, it seemed like a few miles. It was probably only a few hundred yards off the road, but one person could bring a hammer, someone else could bring some nails, someone could bring a saw, and we all got together and built a little camp out there, which was a lot of fun, something to do. And of course, this was before the days of organized activities, but we didn't need anybody to organize us. We always had plenty to do on our own. So as I say, Hermansville was a wonderful place to grow up. I don't think there's a kid in town that one time or another in the winter didn't get his tongue stuck on what we call the town pump. Which anybody that lived in Hermansville knows what the town pump was. It was kind of located between the office and my grandmother's house somewhat, near the railroad tracks. And trying to think of other activities I want to talk about the Pine Mill a little bit more. People would come to visit us, and our house was about maybe a quarter of a mile from the mill, and when it was running, which was most of the time before 1941 or 2 when the lumbering operation ceased, it used to make the darndest noise. And people would come to visit and they say, how could you possibly sleep with all this crazy noise going on? It'd go shoo-hoo, shoo-hoo, because there was one tremendous big steam engine that ran the entire mill. In fact, it was a fascinating thing to watch. I used to love to go down and watch this steam engine operate. And also not too far in front of our house was a branch of the Northwestern Railroad, and they used to run the ore trains through there. And again, people who came to visit, they say, how can you sleep with those trains going by? Well, like anything else, you get used to these things, and you after a while are able to tune them out mentally. Also, another thing I remember is the whistles. And that is, I don't remember what time they exactly blew, but in that it was a mill town, everything went by the whistle. That was either located at the pine mill or I think at the flooring factory. It woke people up in the morning. I think it whistled again 10 minutes before the mill was supposed to start, whistled again at noon, and whistled at quitting time. And then there was another sound I remember particularly. I think it was from the Catholic church bell would chime every evening, I think about 6 o'clock. So, and of course there was the school in Hermansville, which is no longer there, but all of us remember very, very greatly. We had some wonderful teachers then, and I think we got a good education. However, I did not attend high school in Hermansville. My parents sent me away, but I'm not sure if they thought I'd get a better education or if they wanted to just get rid of me. But, and I never did find out. But in any event, I did complete my education, including college and things of that nature. But to me, Hermansville will always be home. I had a lot of wonderful friends there. ideal place to grow up as a child. Always plenty to do. And it was such a mixture of people. And I think this is what made the town so interesting. You could go to the store and you would hear various languages. Primarily there was Italian, Croatian, French, people of Swedish extraction, and English, and everybody got along. That is the wonderful thing about it. And some of the people I remember, for instance, our deputy sheriff in town, who was a wonderful lawman, was Andrew Vescalani, who came from a very, very unusual family. I believe it was his father, who immigrated from Italy, was the shoemaker in town. And the Vescalani family were most interesting. They all went to college. Many of them got advanced degrees. And just typical of, there were many people of considerable talent that came out of Hermansville and made their mark in the world and in various other places. And some of whom I know there was an article written in the Reader's Digest many years ago about Fred Vescalani, who I think later became a professor at Michigan State University. And there were just many stories. The Lombard children, Frances Lombard, a fixture in the town, a wonderful educator, taught in the school for many years. Her husband had been an executive of the Wisconsin Land and Lumber Company, which owned the mills in town. And their sons achieved a notable success in the business world, having gone through school in Hermansville and I believe University of Michigan. But that's just a few examples of some of the great people that still live in Hermansville and who came from Hermansville. That's primarily what I have to say. Pardon?
When some of the children went to school for the first time, they didn't even know how to speak English, did they? How did the rest of the kids, how did that affect the rest of you?
Most of the children I grew up with were second generation. So many of them were bilingual to the extent that they did speak both their language of the parents and English. But it was primarily the older generation, the one older than I, who came over directly from their native lands and brought along a lot of wonderful customs. Nothing I enjoyed more than going to an Italian wedding. There was always a lot of good red wine, and I wasn't supposed to even taste red wine at that age, but I did. And of course, the food was wonderful. And that's just an example of many of the advantages of growing up in Hermansville.
What do you remember about your parents at that time in Hermansville?
Well, they were very attentive parents, and I know my father liked to hunt, as do I, and my mother was very much involved with the local ladies in a organization called the Ladies' Aid, and my father was involved in the Masonic Temple. But they were, of course, as I say, I left when I was about 12 or 13 years old. And
did they stay?
Pardon?
Did they stay, or did they move? You all moved, or did they?
No, they stayed in Hermansville. They just sent me away to a prep school in Chicago, or actually in Lake Forest, Illinois.
Do you think they liked living in Hermansville there?
Well, very much so, because they lived there their entire married life, and in the same house from the time they were married till the time they both died in their 80s. And although they did get away quite often, because particularly my mother liked to travel, and we took family trips such as out to Yellowstone Park, I think in 1939, and then these were driving trips, of course, and then out to the West Coast in 1940, went to Portland, Oregon, and down the coast to San Francisco and saw the San Francisco World's Fair, attended that, and so they did travel quite a bit, and occasionally took us with them. But,
How do you think growing up in Hermansville affected you most in your life?
well, I think it gave me an appreciation of people. And the fact that we all got along so well but we came with so many of us from different economic and cultural backgrounds that we learned to tolerate the differences in one another. And I think this has always been helpful to me to judge people strictly on their own merits, which I think is the only way you can judge people. And I think I learned this in Hermansville, and I never have had a problem adjusting to other environments since then. When I went away to prep school, I had no problem. College, it was very easy to assimilate into the student organization, went into service later, and had no problems. And I think this all stems back to the tolerance and the understanding that I learned in Hermansville.
I've heard that it was a very close community, kind of like a big family.
It was like a big family, and for instance, in those days, Hermansville had some wonderful basketball teams, and when they would go to the regionals and so on, actually, the entire town almost en masse would leave and go attend these games. It was a very, very close community. And I think it was a community that had a lot of pride. Another thing I want to, thought that just occurred to me too was the 4th of July celebrations in Hermansville, which still are considered a homecoming for all those who have once lived there or had family who lived there. As always, today I think the parades are much like they were when I was a child. They set up games, and it truly is a homecoming. They make a big thing out of it, and the people who were born and raised in Hermansville have a lot of pride in themselves, in their community, and it's just a good, solid, basic American community, a wonderful little town.
Great. Yeah, that's wonderful.
Is that all right?
That was wonderful.
You know, it was sort of like